Have you ever been asked to make something for a close friend or a family member? It's always a worry what to charge, as you don't want to undersell your work and you want to make sure you do right by your family. But you've also got to manage the costs of materials and, most importantly, your time. You also need to think about whether or not this is something you've ever made before, what the time scale is, and to cover the costs in case you make a mistake. I recently found myself in this exact situation when my brother asked me if I could make him a game for his wedding. He wanted me to make him a pair of cornhole boards for the guests to play at the wedding. The problem was that we didn't have long before the wedding. I'd never made some before, and I was also best man, so I had to prepare a speech which was nerve-wracking enough without the thought of all those guests scrutinising my work when they were playing the game. But it was my brother, so what was I supposed to say? Of course I said I'd do it, and I told him I'd work out the costs once I'd figured it all out. In this video, I'll break down what materials I used, the time spent, how I made the cornhole boards, and ultimately how much I charged for making them. The first thing I needed to do was to figure out what materials I needed, so I drew up a basic sketch in my notebook and decided that I could do it with a few construction boards at 38mm by 63mm or 2x3s, or you could do it with 2x4s instead, which would cover the frame and the legs. And then I needed a sheet of plywood. I went for 12mm, which I only needed half of. I started by cutting the rough ends off each board, then I marked out the longest length I'd need for my frame and set up a stop block. I just screwed a bit of wood onto my miter saw station and made my first cut. Then I did the same from each of my 4 boards. I'd worked out that in order to make the rest of my timber usable, I'd needed to take the long piece from each of the 4 boards to leave enough for the short pieces on the frame and the leg. Then I measured out the shorter pieces for the frame and adjusted my stop block before cutting them down to size, so I had 4 equal pieces. Then lastly, I measured out for the legs, adjusted the stop block again and cut the 4 legs. And here's what I was left with: 4 long pieces, 4 short pieces and 4 smaller pieces for the legs. Next up, I needed to drill pocket holes in the ends of the 4 short boards for the frame. I put 2 pocket holes in each, and then once I drilled all my pocket holes, I grabbed some 63mm or 2.5-inch pocket hole screws and set to gluing and screwing the frame together. I did that until I had the entire frame assembled and did exactly the same again, so I had 2 frames. Next up, I set my table saw and cut my plywood sheet to size. I decided to leave it just a tiny bit longer and wider than the frame so that I could fit it with a slight overhang, and then come back with a flush trim bit on my router later on to get it fitting perfectly. Once I had my 2 pieces of plywood cut to size, I ran a bead of glue around the entire frame and plopped the top on it and secured it in the corner with a couple of brad nails. Then I could mark out the centre of the frame pieces with my T-square and drill pilot holes along the edges. Then I countersunk them and then I added screws. With the top attached, I flush trimmed the edges to neaten them up, and it fit perfectly to the frame. Next came arguably the hardest bit: cutting the holes. I went about it by marking out the location of the holes and then drew around a bucket that was about 6 inches across. Then I drilled a hole out the middle and carefully cut the circle with my jigsaw. Once I cut it out, I spent some time kneading it up with a file. Once I'd done my first hole, I used this as a template to do my second one. I got it all lined up with my second board and roughly cut the shape with my jigsaw. Once most of the material was gone, I came back with my router and a pattern bit to perfectly match the original hole, which was much easier, simpler, and it meant that I didn't need to take ages shaping and neating up the hole like I did with the first one. I then came back with a round over bit and my router and rounded over the edges of the plywood, both in the hole and all around the outside of the board, just to neaten it up a bit. Oh, and there goes the screw out of the base plate on my router. After sifting through all the sawdust to find the screw from the base plate of my router, I moved on to the legs. These needed to fold out and sit at an angle to raise the back end of the game upwards, so I set my miter saw to a 30-degree angle and cut the end of each of my 4 legs. Then, at the square ends of the legs, I needed to round them off. I trimmed most of it off on the bandsaw and finished it off by sanding to the line on my oscillating spindle sander. Once I'd done one, I just used that as a template to draw the others and did exactly the same thing. Then I needed to drill out the holes for the bolts to go in. I wanted to recess the bolts, and I needed to be able to get a socket from my socket set into the recess to tighten the bolt. So I grabbed a Forstner bit and drilled a hole using my drill press. You always want to drill the biggest hole first when you're doing this type of thing, otherwise you'll really struggle if you've drilled a thinner hole first. Once I drilled the wider hole, I could use the indent from the Forstner bit to centralise a brad point bit, and I drilled all the way through with this. I did this on all 4 legs, making sure that I had holes on the legs with the angles at the bottom going in different directions for each pair. Then I marked out the locations for these on the frame and drilled the holes in the same way, but just using my cordless drill this time, as I couldn't get it under my drill press. And then you can see the bolt drops in nicely and the socket fits on top. Then it was just a case of securing the legs to the frame. I added washers and slotted the bolts in and tightened the nut. I used M8 bolts for this, and here's how they look. They fold out for use and then tuck away nicely for storage. I then filled the screw holes and gave everything a good sanding down. Once I'd done that, I primed and masked it all out with a couple of stripes leading towards the hole, and as these were for a wedding, I used black and white for the main parts, but I switched them over so one was white with a black top and the other was black with a white top. I used gold paint for the stripes and to stencil on a Mr. and Mrs. just to finish them off. I found some nice bean bags that matched the Mr. and Mrs. style in the black and white, so I told my brother to go and order them, and they turned up just in time. I now needed to figure out how much to charge for this whole thing. So here's what I actually spent. £35 or $43 on a sheet of 12mm plywood, £13 or $16 on all the 2x3 boards. I paid £18.27 or $22.67 in dollars for the bolts, nuts and washers, but that left me with loads of spare ones, so the actual cost of these was about a fiver. The paint was free, as my brother works in the automotive industry, so got it for me from his work. However, I definitely just get normal wood paint next time, as this stuff was a pain in the backside to apply. The bean bags were about £20 or $25 from Amazon. I'll put a link in the description if you want to buy some of these to make your own. But as I say, my brother paid for these. So all in, I'd spent about £66.27 or $81.66 and only used half a sheet of plywood. It actually only took me a couple of hours to make them, so if I were to make them again, I reckon it'd cost me no more than about £50 or around 62 US dollars. And I'd probably look to sell them for between £150 and £200 for a pair, or if you're in the US, then probably around $200 to $250, depending on if I included the bean bags, and it'd also depend on how the shipping worked out. I may even charge that on top. I reckon I'd clear about £100 to £150 profit from them. I'd then gauge the demand and potentially put the prices up if they prove to be popular. So the big question is, how much did I charge my brother for them? Obviously I didn't charge him anything and gave it to him as a wedding present. What kind of a guy do you think I am? I'll see you on the next video, which you can find right here.